Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Today's episode is on how to improve your well-being and recover from mental illness with Dr. Lindsay Oades. Lindsay is an internationally acclaimed, multi-award-winning well-being scientist, researcher, public policy strategist, educator, and author. He's Deputy Dean and Professor of Wellbeing Science at the University of Melbourne. His major research contribution has been in well-being and mental health recovery. He has developed a mental health recovery model known as the collaborative recovery model, which is a positive psychology coaching model used to assist people with mental illness. And we discuss that model and how exactly he's learned from his research how to most effectively help people recover from mental illness using that model in the episode. And it's also linked in our show notes. Lindsay is the author of 6 books and over 150 journal articles and book chapters related to well-being, recovery, and coaching. As a sought-after speaker known to provoke thought, Lindsay has given keynote or invited presentations in 14 nations. Now, of the key topics we discuss in this episode, first we discuss what he's learned most about how to improve well-being from the wide breadth of research he's done. We begin by asking him what is a kind of a key lesson he's learned from his research on how people can most effectively improve their well-being. We then move in to discuss how to understand what it means to recover from mental illness and how you can track that and know when you've recovered from mental illness. And that's we dig into his collaborative recovery model and what he's learned from that and what research has shown from that about recovery and about how to recover from mental illness. That recovery model outlines 4 stages of recovery called awareness, preparation, rebuilding, and growth. We discuss those stages and what we can learn from those about recovery. We also discuss the concept of wellbeing literacy, on which Lindsay has a forthcoming book this year. Wellbeing literacy is a capability. It's what we can be and do, and it involves intentional language use about and for well-being. And we discuss what exactly wellbeing literacy is, why it's important, and get some examples of this from research he's done, particularly with schools. Lindsay's also worked extensively on how to promote and understand what flourishing means in education and how to most effectively promote human flourishing in and through education. He's worked with UNESCO on this recently, and we discuss his work with UNESCO on this and his view that human flourishing is the central purpose of education and what his research has shown about how to most effectively promote flourishing in and through education. It's a fascinating conversation on important areas of well-being and flourishing. We hope you love it. This is How to Improve Your Well-Being and Recover from Mental Illness with Dr. Lindsay Oades. All right, Lindsay, welcome. How are you?
Great. Nice to be with you, John. Early morning here on a Friday in Melbourne, Australia. So lovely to meet you and be with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As are we, and thank you so much for joining us at 7 o'clock in the morning for what's going to be a great conversation. Thank you. So you are an expert on wellbeing science, and we're very excited to dig into your expertise today. And you've worked extensively on how to most effectively promote wellbeing and help people recover from mental illness. And we're going to dive into various areas of your work today. But let's start with a very general question. What is one particularly important lesson you found from your research about how people can improve their wellbeing?
That's a great question. I probably would say, or will say, not so much just my research, but research in general, that, the reading and the talking to people around the world about this one. And the theme that continually comes up in multiple ways is the importance of relationships. So that can be interpersonal, intimate relationships, can be work relationships, family relationships, but also more broadly relationships with community and connection with place and sense of belonging. So that sort of cluster of interpersonal relationships, connection with communities, connections with others, and connection with place, that is the one that seems to be across cultures everywhere. So anything we can do to improve aspects of those, be simple things by maintaining time in our week to foster our social relationships, or just really taking that area seriously, It's quite enticing to have other things, this special technique will improve you and this will that. But that fundamental basis of us as social beings, I think really is the place to start.
All right. Well, let's start with that. That's a great place to start. We've had several episodes looking at research and relationships. We'd love to learn about yours as well. So, what is one particularly effective strategy you found in your research about how to do that, cultivate that sense of community and belonging in particular?
Okay, so with community and belonging, that the belonging part's probably not my particular research area, but I imagine at some stage later this morning, we'll talk about my research on wellbeing literacy, which is exactly that. It's how to use language. And one of the reasons I chose that area of research is language is inherently relational. It's how we build relationships, and that particular area is based on how we improve our communication, but not just how we improve our communication in general, how we improve it in the service of wellbeing. So that area is one of my key current research areas, and we will be we just got a new book contract for a book that we're hopefully will get out this year, probably late this year, on that very area of wellbeing literacy. And we probably have 30 contributors from around the world.
Oh, amazing.
On that topic.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Well, let's dig into that, wellbeing literacy. So you've introduced this in your research. It's a capability, what we can be and do that involves intentional language use about and for well-being. So you describe what exactly well-being literacy is and why it's important.
I'm so glad you remember the definition, because we spend so long getting each of those words correct. The shorthand definition I use is how we communicate about and for well-being. What we've been trying to do with that, I've worked both in health contexts and currently more in an educational context. And it struck me that in the health context, people are doing interventions, randomised controlled trials, programs, interventions, that sort of thing, be they medical or psychological. Positive psychology interventions, or PPIs as they are called, is example of that paradigm. If you come to an education context, which is exactly how my career has tracked in that direction, health first and then education later, educationalists, teachers, they will tell you that teaching is an intervention. You don't need to have an intervention. Teaching itself is an intervention. They're always intervening through teaching and people learning. So I became curious about how those two things could be combined, and that's where wellbeing literacy was born and how that came to be. And obviously we know the benefits of literacy per se around the world. People who are literate do better in life, live longer. There are multiple benefits. What used to be called how to read and write, but I started communicating with literacy learners and educators about how they teach literacy. And what became evident was more than it being reading and writing, it's also speaking and listening, creating things so that people can view them. So it's a multimodal skill. And the first thing about literacy per se is it's how we use language. It's not just people, you say literacy, people hear vocabulary, but it's actually the active use of language in real context. So I started thinking this is ubiquitous. We all, or nearly all of us, use language all of the time, every day. So if we're looking for a lever to impact on wellbeing and population wellbeing, to me, language was a very good place to start. And rather than being a single intervention that people might use in a particular context of their life, if we can help people to use language better in the service of wellbeing, that was my motivator to do this, and that has relevance to multiple contexts. So you may hear the word literacy and think about school education, but we're actually talking about all of our relationships. You can use we use language in our intimate relationships, our friendships, in the workplace, in education contexts. So it is portable and relevant everywhere, but it will look different everywhere. So language has communities. How adolescent girls talk to each other may be very different than how you talk to your boss in an organisation. But going further than this, it is about the power of language to shape our thought and behaviour, and that there's a lot of philosophy of language about that. So the work of Wittgenstein, Vygotsky, etc., and how language actually shapes how we think and how we view the world. And given that most psychological ideas are effectively metaphorical, so if you take the great psychological traditions, the Freudian traditions based on a metaphor of a steam pressure, so we repress our emotions and then they bust out. The cognitive traditions are based on information processing, so the mind as a computer. So all these non-physical things, we use metaphors, so we use language to construct them. So if we can do that better, that is another way of impacting on assisting people to experience wellbeing. And if we remember from evolutionary biology, we've been blessed with lots of survival mechanisms, but the residual result of that is that most of our vocabulary is negatively valenced. That is, they're negative words. They're things about threat, and there is quite a bit of evidence for that. And you can go across the disciplines and argue about which discipline has more negative vocabulary. So similar to the sort of fundamental ideas of positive psychology, that we have to work a little harder at being positive because of a negativity bias, it is reflected in our vocabulary and our language use. So that were some of the ideas behind wellbeing literacy. To package it more tangibly, we have what's called the capability model of wellbeing literacy, which has 5 parts or 5 components. The first one being the basics, in my view, the vocabulary and knowledge about wellbeing, the standard thing. What words do we use, and what are the sort of fundamental assumptions of what those words are about? The second 2 are comprehending and composing, or for language oriented people, they may know them as receptive language and expressive language use. But importantly, inside those 2, they pair up. So if we think about reading and writing, speaking and listening, creating and viewing, they're all the composing, so expressing oneself and comprehending. Listening, for example, is part of that. They're all skills. We have skills, we have vocabulary, but language doesn't use itself. Language is used in a context, and it has users who have intentions. So they are the last 2 parts of the model. The adapting to context. You may speak to your romantic partner with different language than you, sure. And not just with different language, but in a different way than you speak in a formal context, masculine, feminine. There are multiple examples of that. And also the final one, intentionality or habit of intention. Do we have the capability to consistently intentionally use language, or does it just slip out? And remember, when we say language, I'm talking about reading, writing, speaking, listening, creating, and viewing. That picks up a lot of things, like emojis on text use, social media use, even the way we might dress intentionally could have a communicative, that's a fancy word, part to it. So it becomes a very socio-cultural view, but it's also very applicable across many contexts. And currently we've been talking with and working with creative artists with some of the other multimodal aspects of this in creating visual art, these sorts of ideas. So that's a summary. Hopefully, I've got across the importance of language and the breadth of places where this can be relevant.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. So can we, to make it really clear for listeners, can we get some concrete examples of well-being literacy? And you've given like quite a wide breadth as well, like emojis and the way people express themselves through the way they dress and so on. So what would be an example of, say, a piece of well-being literacy or an area of literacy, like a topic that's discussed or a way it's expressed that is typically absent, say, in schools, but you've tried to introduce into schools to improve well-being literacy and understanding?
Yeah, great question. So I'll give an example at the moment. One of my PhD students, Lisa Baker, is currently working on wellbeing literacy in early childhood education and care. So people who are children who are 3 to 5 years old, and we're working with the early childhood educators, kindergarten, whatever term, in whichever country we're in. We're talking about children who are 3 to 5, usually in sort of preschool care, that age. I just refer to them as the little guys. So Lisa and I have been working with the teachers in that context, and I'll give one example. A simple statement to, say, a 5-year-old, are you the boss of your body? Which is really about helping young children to self-regulate. And they commonly, a lot of the wellbeing literacy work is not new. What it does is it gives people a framework to make sense of what they're doing and extend it. And that's exactly what we're finding with the early childhood educators. So they have a set of skills, they have a set of ways of both managing and teaching the young children. So helping a child to say, are you the boss of your own body, which is due for, are you able to calm yourself down? They also do art, and so they intentionally use the creation of art as a way of articulating and looking at how they're feeling or how they should be or could be treating others. And that's actually quite a good example, because that's also the very age where you see a lot of language, social and emotional development. So that's at that end. At a different end, if you can think about that's at an individual child, if you like, and also the teacher-child relationship, which is language use in and of itself. So we can look at the language use of the teacher as well as the language use of the child. But if we come to an all-adult context, we have started doing some work in workplaces. And think about an organisation. We work with some community organisations in mental health context. People think of organisations as what they do and the resources they manage. But from a wellbeing literacy perspective, what's the language use in the organisation? So we've actually looked at audits of the way people use language in an organisation. So as a network of relationships that use language. And this particular example relates to some of the work that I've previously done in mental health systems in collaborative recovery in that area.
Which we want to get into. Yeah,
we will probably talk about, So if we look at the language that gets used, I was originally trained and worked briefly as a clinical psychologist. And one of the things that struck me was the illness-saturated language that was used in the acute and rehabilitation mental health services. But when I was talking with many of the people experiencing mental illness, when you actually really got down to what they were interested in life, it related to areas of wellbeing. But I found they didn't have the vocabulary to actually express it. They had a vocabulary which was coming from the environments in which they had been, namely repeat users of mental health services. So another way we're using wellbeing literacy is to actually audit and look at and work with organisations to actually look at the way they're using language across their organisations. So not just one-to-one, but the whole organisational language. And it isn't just about making everything positive. It's about people having the choices available to them by language and its narratives and its metaphors to construct different realities and different possibilities. And the mental health one is a strong example because I've spoken to people who literally did not even have the language, or it was so submerged or detached from their experience that wellbeing was not a story that they could construct themselves.
Yeah.
So early childhood and organisations, a couple of examples there. There are, because it's a multi-part model, there are different parts to it you can use, and that's really important. It will look very different in different places because different contexts are different language communities.
I want to ask you a question. This is super interesting. So there's a couple of things I really like about this. One, the framing of sort of recovering from the quote unquote bad, if you will, right? But also kind of nourishing the good. But I'm also curious because you've mentioned, like, clearly you're very, very strategic, I think, and thoughtful about the language that you use because you've provided a bunch of reasons why that's so important. So you correct me if I'm wrong, but presumably you've been very specific about why you're using mental illness as opposed to something like ill-being, where on the other side there's well-being, right? And I'm curious if you could tease that out for us a little bit, just so listeners understand really what you mean by mental illness, maybe juxtaposed with well-being, but how that's different maybe in your mind from ill-being, or maybe they're not.
No, sure. So when I use mental illness, illness was, if we track the history of illness, illness is construed as an experience, whereas disease isn't necessarily an experience, as a way of categorising a set of symptoms. However, mental illness has become known as as a term that gets used, and diagnosis of illness and diagnosis of mental illness. So when I use that term, I'm usually referring to something that someone has diagnosed somewhere within maybe DSM or ICD or that sort of psychiatric or clinical psychological view. But ill-being would be a more general term where there's no diagnosis, but someone is not experiencing, they are experiencing illness and would probably get diagnosed. Whereas well-being at the opposite end. Importantly, both those words being, though, are really important because in both cases they infer a high level of subjective experience. We're talking about the experience of illness or the experience of wellness, and that becomes very relevant later. People, unfortunately, maybe it's fortunate for me because I spend my life researching it and talking to people about it, but people mix these things up a lot. And I often an entomologist studies insects, and they might call everything, general public might call everything a bug, and the same thing tends to happen with the wellbeing science. They might call everything happiness and use everything interchangeably, but the different meanings of these words are really important. That distinction between mental illness and well-being or ill-being, they become very important and they have real effects. If you see illness and well-being as opposites, if you have a long-term illness or a diagnosed condition such as schizophrenia, which is a condition around the world that probably accounts for the most hospital bed days. So it takes up a lot of...
Really?
Yeah, takes up a lot of use.
Huh.
Because people stay in hospital for so long.
Sure.
So in the US, it probably gets take more of a disability model. And in the US, the word disease is used more freely in mental health contexts. But depending on whichever context you're in, whichever nation you're in, some version of schizophrenia takes up a lot of bed days. Traditionally, that's had a very medical approach to it. And when we start talking about words like illness and recovery, they'll use the word recovery, and that will often mean symptom reduction. And when the recovery movement came from patients or users or consumers, people who have lived with illness, repeat users of hospitals, they started saying, well, we'll define what recovery is. We won't. It's not the medical system that will define what recovery is. Recovery for us is a lived experience, which is multifaceted. And this is where some of my earlier work came from in terms of the recovery movement, because it was actually a debate about what is recovery and who decides. So you have the sort of power issues of life. So Nick, if I was to decide what your life goals are and tell you them, I would expect probably you'd resist that, particularly if you didn't know me and say, who are you to tell me what my life goals are?
Of course.
But in some aspects, that's exactly what was happening in the mental health context. These are very distressed, very disenfranchised people. So in no way am I suggesting that this is not an anti-psychiatry comment here. It's not a denial of some of the major problems here. It's more a commentary on the systems that have been responding. And this is where I was attracted to the recovery movement, because it was about agency, it was about autonomy. And then when I unpacked it, what I found was very disenfranchised people who've lived, say, with schizophrenia for 15 years. When we really talk to them and when we study their narratives, they're actually seeking well-being. And when I say that, you might say, well, obviously they were. But actually what I'm saying is they were seeking the very things that the science of well-being, that the science of positive psychology was studying. However, not getting traction in that way. It was all about symptom reduction. So if you track the history of psychiatry, it goes through a series of phases. Separation, we separate people. Then we started to medicate them. Then we started to rehabilitate them. And then the recovery movement came later in terms of autonomous people getting a say in what constitutes recovery for them. And interestingly, when you actually ask the mental health people living with mental illness, mental health consumers, mental health participants, users, whichever term we use, often it was a sense of autonomy, a sense of relationship, community, those things. Reducing symptoms was not their primary goal. It might have been something that helped achieve their goals, but it's not their primary goal. And so the recovery movement has really been a debate about that. And as I said, it's interested me because it dovetails directly with the wellbeing piece. And it at the heart of it's about autonomy and agency, which we also know big parts of the wellbeing science literature tells us that they are key predictors of wellbeing. Yeah. So that's sort of how it came together for me. But I was particularly interested in their narratives, which is also the earlier stages of the wellbeing literacy. That is, how are we actually helping them to construct alternative stories about their lives? And people say, well, that doesn't cure schizophrenia. And so, no, we're not in the paradigm of curing it. We're actually, they may or may not have symptom reduction. They hopefully have some, or they manage their symptoms, but it's actually about the other piece and living with and beyond illness. So just to loop right back, the reason some of the definitions are so important, if you see well-being and ill-being, or well-being and illness as opposites, it means that the people, say, for example, people with schizophrenia or any long-term chronic illness can't experience well-being. because they're opposites. They're logically opposites. That's why having a couple of dimensions to think about it, like the work of Corey Keyes, they might sound very theoretical, 2 dimensions, 1 dimension, but they're actually really important because if you can have symptoms of illness but also experience well-being, which is exactly what happens for people with long-term illnesses, that's important. Otherwise, you logically shut out the idea. A tangible, to help people get their heads around that, the debates about masculinity and femininity are similar. If masculine and feminine are opposites, you can only, and you move up and down a dimension, you can only be one or the other at one time. But a male can be masculine, demonstrate masculine and feminine qualities. A female can demonstrate masculine and feminine qualities. That's taking 1 dimension to 2 dimension, and obviously that I'm not using that example to be debating some of the current gender issues. I'm using
understood.
Just to understand how 1 dimension versus 2 dimensions actually really has real life effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's an important both and, right? You'll often hear about mixed emotions, gratitude as another example, but this idea that people either need to feel quote unquote happy or thriving or positive all the time, or there's a full blown mental illness or something along those lines, and no nuance or mixture in between is absurd, right? So your point's well made. Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
So let's just clarify then to sum up these important points you've made about recovery. So you've kind of given us a good account of what it means to recover from mental illness. How does someone identify, either the person themselves who's been suffering from mental illness or others in that person's life? How do we identify when someone's recovered from mental illness?
Okay, so this is where the two viewpoints of what recovery is matter. I mean, one distinction that has been used is clinical recovery, which is the more traditional medical symptom reduction, and that's well worn. That idea, you can measure symptoms, people report their symptoms. That's the traditional medical approach. Personal recovery, which is more the recovery I've been talking about, which is the broader-based subjective recovery. Similar to concepts like flourishing, they're viewed as a process, so they may never be recovered as such, but on a recovery process. So we had an early model called psychological recovery, which had 4 areas: meaning, hope, identity, and responsibility. We actually developed some scales, self-report scales for people about whether their meaning was improving in their life, whether their sense of identity, who they were, was improving and was less illness saturated. whether their hopefulness was increasing, and whether they were taking more self-responsibility to manage their own health and well-being. So that was Stages of Recovery instrument, which we published and been translated into multiple languages, etc. And we wrote a book, Psychological Recovery, which documents that. That's very, again, that is very contentious in some ways, because the original recovery movement was, well, we'll decide what it is, and then you're bringing in all these things again to do the same to us and measure us to justify whether we've recovered or not.
Sure.
So there's a political and identity debate about that as well. But we had those 4 areas. My former colleague, well, he's still a colleague, but the work is quite a long time ago, Mike Slade, who was at King's College London, who's now at University of Nottingham, he works extensively on this area, and they have other ways of measuring or tracking that. To be honest, I was always more interested in the way a person's self-monitored than I was in the big measures of multiple people, whether they're on the journey. Because people develop skills to monitor their own, effectively monitor their own well-being. And this is why coaching and self-regulation, whether you have schizophrenia or whether you don't, they're the same processes. So that was what I've become much more interested in, is can I see myself improving or not, or when the fundamental idea of self-management, self-regulation and monitoring was more interesting to me than some of the scales or measurement of groups. Harder to get funding for, but to me was always more interesting.
Awesome, thank you, Lindsay. And we've added that book you mentioned, Psychological Recovery, to our show notes. So you've developed this interesting model, the collaborative recovery model, and in that you describe the stages of recovery, 4 stages: awareness, preparation, rebuilding, and growth. Could you please describe these stages?
So there's two parts here. So those stages relate to those 4 areas of hope, identity, meaning, and recovery. So that was the original psychological recovery work. So where those stages came from, again, contentious, because some people don't like to be told they're going through stages and etc. But they came from my former PhD student, Dr. Retta Andreasen, who's also the author of the key author on the psychological recovery book I just quoted. And that work was derived from looking at multiple years of published narratives from people who have lived with serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or repeat users of hospitals is a more direct way of putting it. When I mean repeat users, I mean long-term repeat use. So those stages were done from doing narrative analyses, thematic analyses of all of those published narratives from around the world for about, I can't remember exactly whether it was 15 years, 20 years, but it was an extended period of time. We Retta in particular spent a long time analysing each of those, and that also went into the development of the stages of recovery instruments. So we tracked hope, meaning, identity, and responsibility as themes across those 4 stages. And then that was used to develop what was called the STORY, Stages of Recovery instrument, which we then correlated with other wellbeing instruments. But importantly, as well as the research piece, it got developed into sets of tools that practitioners could use. Alongside that work, I was also working on the collaborative recovery model, which was really effectively a coaching model. Are people ready to change? What are their needs and strengths? what are their goals and values, and then are they implementing it, and a review cycle. So sort of a typical coaching style model, but we embedded that in some guiding principles, which were autonomy support, which is a well-known concept from self-determination theory, and exactly what we were just talking about, the idea that all interactions with people living with mental illness should be thought of within a sort of lifelong recovery idea rather than a short-term symptom reduction idea. So that was the model that we used in collaborative recovery. We developed it to train mental health workforces, which was done particularly in Australia. We also did it in Canada and Hong Kong. But at the heart of it, what it was trying to assist workforces, particularly but not exclusively nursing workforces in mental health services, to think about the longer-term recovery processes, to work collaboratively with people living with mental illness, not to assume a totally clinical relationship, which was all about symptom reduction, but to try to bring in the idea of growth, some aspects of autonomy. Autonomy is a very contentious concept in some of these contexts, because a lot of the contexts are about risk, etc., and elevating the narrative of the person living with illness. So that was the essence of it. So it was actually a service, an organisational delivery and service delivery and organisational development approach. The reason it was called collaborative recovery is because it was really emphasising the quality of the relationship between staff who are trying to help people living with mental illness and the person living with mental illness. And of course, part of that also started bringing in the consumer or user participation movement. So people who have lived with illness helping other people who have lived with illness. That's just been a major movement in mental health services. Mm-hmm. So effectively bringing in coaching processes and wellbeing related ideas linked to the bottom-up recovery movement. That was where this work came from. So that's quite. Things have moved on since then. That was work I was doing about 10 to 15 years ago. But back then it was quite early versions of some of these aspects. And what struck me so strongly was you had these ideas of psychology, positive psychology, goal setting, whole areas, well-established areas in the literature, and yet I'd constantly go out and meet practitioners, and they'd never heard of different discipline, different area, and I'd also have, and still to this day, have patients or mental health consumers say, "Oh, I wish I was given this 10 years ago. Where was it? Why wasn't I told of these concepts and these ideas about growth and development?" Which on one hand was lovely, but on another hand was tragic, because they could have been exposed to these ideas earlier. Mm-hmm. And I say all this without saying that mental health services or the people in them are bad. It's more an example of how we set up systems and the assumptions of the systems embedded in the language we use can have unintended consequences, which the history of psychiatry is full of.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Again, kind of a both and, but speaking of systems, let's take a little bit of a veer here in our few remaining minutes. You've done quite a bit of work in sort of well-being in education or flourishing in education, including some work with UNESCO on really what the future of education looks like. And I wonder if you might share with us and the audience a little bit about some of the findings there and what you feel the role of education as a system is. John and I both come from the world of education. This is very important to us, and would love to hear from you.
Well, I better be careful then, Nick, and not say anything too bad. So the work with UNESCO, I was asked, I think it was in the year 2000. I remember it. I remember it because we were during COVID, and we were in Melbourne, and it was during lockdown. I got an invitation to join a team on UNESCO to do what is called the International Science and Evidence-Based Assessment of Education, which is a fairly large review of education, which followed what was known as the Delors Report, which hadn't happened since about 1996. So essentially what it was about is looking at the role of what is human flourishing and how does it relate to education, and what is the scientific evidence of that for education systems. And that was ironically contentious for some, because some people don't believe that science should inform education systems, which for me was a bit odd. But if we think about 130,
can you explain that for me? That sounds puzzling.
Yeah. So you have a group of, if we think about education systems in UNESCO, you've got 130 plus 130 member states of the UN. So you have people all around the world, different views of what education is. And a lot of people who value education come from the humanities, so they come from areas of the non-scientific branch of sociology or other aspects of humanities, etc. They don't like this, particularly a scientific worldview, because they may perceive it as controlling, etc. So there's a sort of rejection of science or scientism. That was part of it. But fundamentally, importantly, what we were asked to do, and the group I was on in particular, what is flourishing, or what is human flourishing, what is education, and how are the two related? And they're seemingly simple questions until you start trying to answer them and create documents which are palatable to be used across 130 nations. That's a bigger policy challenge. But interestingly and importantly, starting with the definition of human flourishing that we, as a group of, I was working with a group of educational philosophers, and I was representing the more empirical wellbeing science end of it, even though I am very interested in philosophy as well. But we came to a definition of human flourishing, importantly as a process, and one of the things that people, when they hear flourishing, they don't always think of it as a process. So as an optimal process of realising our potential, experiencing wellbeing while we're doing it, living in line with humanistic values and our own values. So the idea that there's some general values plus some that we choose ourselves, and all of this supported by an enabling environment. So there are lots of parts to that definition, but they're all important. Tangibly, the one about realising our potential, but experiencing wellbeing while we do it. Should we have fun while we're at school? That's the shorthand version of that for school education. And a lot of people say, of course, and some people say, no, the role of school is academic. So you actually get different debates on that. And interestingly, there's also different debates on autonomy. How would you, as an adult, be told that you had to go somewhere for 12 years with people you don't know and spend time with them every day, but have no choice over it? So the autonomy debate, or the rights of the child from a liberal perspective, was also interesting. But to come back to the other part of the UNESCO, what is education? There are many answers over that. Our answer to what is education is it's a relationship between a teacher and a learner, which is, yes, very broad, but that's deliberate. You actually have a relational definition. So here you have something really important. You have a relationship between a teacher and a learner, and then education becomes a relationship between a teacher and a learner in the service of human flourishing, in the service of realising one's potential. What it does by putting human flourishing as a core aim of and purpose of education, all of these other debates about academic achievement, experiencing wellbeing at school, values, and enabling environment, they're all in there. So I call human flourishing like the mother concept under which a lot of these other, or the umbrella, the big umbrella concept under which a lot of these other things occur. And education is a core. The core purpose of education is that, and this gets up at a higher level. We have these debates about, should we do positive education or social and emotional learning classes at school? Should it be an add-on, a bolt-on? This work flips it the other way around. And if we track the history of social sciences, they were developed to improve wellbeing. That was their purpose. So we sort of lost sight of the original purpose of some of these social institutions. So that is interesting. To juxtapose that, this is an argument about the purpose of education. This is UNESCO, which obviously takes a more humanistic viewpoint. You have an alternative view that the role of education is for economic, to develop human capital. So the OECD policies will take a more economic view of education. It's to develop human capital, which will drive economies, and then wellbeing is a nice byproduct. So you've got this view, which as I said, is a debate about how we talk about what we're doing compared to an economic lens, which is a different way of viewing education. The reason this one attracts me is because it is explicit about values. Some people want to sidestep values and ethics, but if you want to talk about flourishing and wellbeing, you can't sidestep values and ethics. They're central. So that's a broad view of that. But listeners, I'll actually ask them, what do they view as the central purpose of education? Because it's actually a very interesting question to ponder. You get rapid answers like, so I can get a job, but then that may be their purpose of their education at that time. But the broader question is, what's the purpose of the human endeavour of education? And that's where this taps into, which I find sits very nicely alongside human flourishing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Framing what we do.
Yeah, and in that research report, which we've linked in our show notes, UNESCO states, and you state, and you co-authored a paper for that human flourishing is the central purpose of education. Now, there's a million more things we'd love to dive into with your breadth of work, Lindsay, but we're coming close to the end now. So just a final question. Is there anything in particular you've got coming out this year, publication-wise, or a particular website that listeners and viewers of this episode could learn more about your work from?
Sure. We have, later in the year, we do have, there's a book coming out headed by Jonathan Passmore and my colleague, Badri Bajij. We have an edited book coming out on coaching for health and wellbeing. That's coming out quite soon. Later in the year, hopefully, we will see the book coming out on wellbeing literacy, which has around 26 chapters, I think 35-ish authors from around the world taking wellbeing literacy and exploring it in their different contexts. What is it? How to measure it? How are people using it? What do people think of it? So it's a sort of, we're trying to build that wellbeing literacy community. So the two books are probably the key things that are heading out this year. So look out for those two. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And we'll add a link on wellbeing literacy to the show notes as well. Thank you, all of you, for watching and listening. This fascinating conversation with Dr. Lindsay Oades. This has been How to Improve Your Wellbeing and Recover from Mental Illness with Dr. Lindsay Oades. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.